it's my pleasure now to introduce to you my dear friend Josef Wiesehofer, actually somebody who does not really have to be introduced. He's a master in Iranian studies from the Achaemenid through the Parthian and Sasanian period with masterpieces of publications. And Josef is going to talk today about the state of Achaemenid studies. So please, Josef, the floor is yours.
My wholeheartedly felt thanks also go to the organizers of this conference, and they probably invited me to Los Angeles with this topic because I'm one of the few who attended all the conferences of the first round of the Achaemenid History Workshops in Groningen, London, and Ann Arbor in the 1980s and 1990s. It is certainly not my task today to recall in detail the refreshing novelty of these conferences, so wonderfully organized by my late dear colleague and friend Helene Sanchisi-Werdenberg. The bringing together of scholars from the most diverse disciplines and origins, the theoretical and methodological reorientation of research, which recognized hierarchies of sources and asked intensively about the expressiveness and intention of testimonies, which developed new questions and reflected on research results conceptually in terms of content and method. The interest in questions of reception history. In organizing the conferences, but above all in maintaining the series Achaemenid History, in which the papers of the conferences were published, Helene was supported above all by 4 other people from among the participants. Amelie Court, to whom Achaemenid studies owes so many suggestions and whose death we had to mourn only a few months ago. Margaret Kuhl-Root from Ann Arbor, Jan-Willem Drevers, friend and colleague from Groningen, and Wouter Henkelmann, known to all for his excellent studies on the Elamite texts from Persepolis. Without them, but also without other regular participants in the conferences, here the name of my friend Pierre Brion should be mentioned above all. Achaemenid research would not have made the progress it has. And yet, time does not stand still, and the giants on whose shoulders we stand have always encouraged us to continue researching and teaching. Helene, Amelie, Margaret, and Pierre have been, and I'm sure would be, pleased to see that their theoretical, methodological, and substantive suggestions have led to an even greater degree of cooperation, depth of reflection, and breadth of content in Achaemenid studies worldwide. After Helene's much too early death, not least Amelie, Margaret, and Pierre themselves have contributed quite significantly to this progress. My following assessment of what has been achieved in the meantime can, however, be no more than a stock-taking, a personal and individual one at that, which not all of you must share. In the following, I will concentrate on a few areas of research in which progress seems particularly evident to me. Firstly, the situation of the source material in the light of new discoveries and re-evaluations of the existing texts and monuments. Secondly, the field of newer tendencies in the formation of theory, the formulation of questions, and the methodology of research, as well as new forms of scholarly organization. I would then like to, thirdly, briefly present examples of some special areas of content in which significant research progress has been made. Then, fourthly, I am particularly interested in the position of the Persian Empire in global historical and Near Eastern contexts. Robert already mentioned that idea, as well as in imperial contexts spanning epochs Fifthly, I shall shortly comment, and very shortly comment, on the diversity of representations of the empire in later political and cultural debates. The first thing to be mentioned here is the enormously sharpened view of the source material since the 1980s, which is increasingly giving the evidence from the soil of the Achaemenid Empire the importance it deserves. Through the cooperation of various academic disciplines, the multilingualism cultivated in the empire as the basis for the diversity of sources has received the recognition it deserves. And this cooperation has at the same time corrected the era of Hellenocentric, but also Mesopotamiocentric and Iranocentric views of the empire and its rulers. Among other things, this textual turn has led to due attention being paid to the Aramaic language and script, as well as to the Elamites and Elamite culture as the written culture that had a decisive influence on the development of the early Persian Empire. However, the pronounced orality of the Iranian cultures and the characteristics of the Mesopotamian cultures, which were formed in a long period of writing, have sometimes led one to forget that the ideological and factual center of the empire was always on the Iranian highlands. On the other hand, the primacy of the spoken word over the written one in Iran has also encouraged the study of the non-written evidence from the highlands and Central Asia. The Greek tradition, which for a long time dominated the discourse on the empire, has rightly receded into the background as far as the actual structures and institutions of the empire are concerned. Unfortunately, in my view, not always to the extent necessary in my discipline and in biblical studies, as the treatment of Herodotus' list of nomoi alone shows. On the other hand, Greek images of the Persian Empire and its rule promise insights, especially since these images have remained influential in the history of reception in Europe and the US up to the present day. One need only think of catchwords such as Oriental despotism or the idea of Marathon, Thermopylae, or Salamis as European sites of remembrance. Conferences, a wealth of articles on the genre, intention, and reception of Greco-Roman literary works, as well as a series devoted to images of the Near East in Greco-Roman cultures, that is, Cleo, have impressively underlined the diversity of such paths from east to west, the wealth of images of Persia, their preconditions, contexts, and consequences, and have called for the necessary caution in reconstructing Achaemenid realia. The Cleo volumes on Herodotus, Xenophon's Cyropedia, Ctesias, or Arrian are representative of this strand of research. The diversity, contextuality, and receptivity of literary approaches to the foreign, which often enough oscillate between rejection and fascination, can also be observed in the material tradition of the West. In addition, as far as the diverse testimonies of the Achaemenid Empire are concerned, there are exemplary annotated text editions, such as those of the Ashama texts by Christopher Taplin and John Marr, of the Persepolis tablets by Matthew Stolper, Walter Henkelmann, and others, the Babylonian economic texts by Michael Jursa, Bert van der Speck, and others, the royal inscriptions by Rüdiger Schmidt and others, but also, for example, Amelie Kurtz's excellent annotated collection of sources. They have surely set linguistic, philological, and historical standards. And as far as archaeological research is concerned, the conference volume L'Archéologie de l'Empire Achaemenide, Nouvelles Recherches, published in 2005 by Pierre Brion and Rémy Boucharlat, Dan Pott's companion to the archaeology of the ancient Near East, and other handbooks and contributions, some of them with a regional focus, such as the recently published Companion to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which I will discuss later, illustrate the progress made in research in recent decades. The immensely stimulating work of Matthew Canepa has furthermore made the traces of the imperial presence and its administrative, economic, and building policies visible in the local natural archives, in the archaeological evidence, and in the landscape. In terms of textual and pictorial evidence, Achaemenid.com, Beth has already mentioned that, provides an important online platform for scholarly research and public interest in the Persian Empire, with access to images and data on Achaemenid period collections in many museums around the world. The Achaemenid project at the Oriental Institute of Chicago enriches these online resources with images and documentation of well-preserved objects. However, archaeological research in particular is and remains incomplete, as Beth showed us today. Many questions have yet to be asked of the surviving material, regardless of its provenance. Many methodological approaches to it have yet to be opened up, and especially in the Near East and Central Asia, spectacular new finds of pottery, inscriptions, or monuments, such as the copy of the Babylonian Ishtar Gate recently excavated near Persepolis, are significantly expanding or influencing our view of ancient Iran. A few minutes ago, I referred to the indispensability of disciplinary cooperation. Fortunately, this has also made the frequently observed dispute over whether philology, archaeology, or historiography should be given priority in the study of ancient Persia superfluous. Moreover, in recent years, each discipline has increasingly developed and reflected on its theoretical and methodological tools. This is the only way to explain the quality of the handbooks on ancient Iran or the Achaemenid Empire that have appeared in the meantime, which adequately take into account the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, or religious diversity of the empire's territories, the politically advised and intended diversity of the justifications and means of rule, as well as the spectrum of worldviews, some of which are based on older traditions. These handbooks are as wary of culturally essentialist patterns of interpretation as they are of schematic, static descriptions of the empire. In the sense of Frederick Barth's distinction between the cultural imprint of ethnic groups on the one hand and ethnic boundary processes on the other, culturally coded processes of social differentiation have recently also been taken into account in Achaemenid studies. Self-attributions and attributions to the other are considered, as is the differentiation of imperial societies along various dimensions, such as gender, origin, social stratification, or political influence. Identities, it is shown, can be situational and multiple. As socio-politically effective categories, their processes of formation, their modes of action, and their real political weight are taken into account. The work of my student Melinda Ho, among others, on the relationship between globalization and localism in the Hellenistic period, but also, for example, more recent work on religious practice in Achaemenid Egypt and elsewhere show that what matters is less the origin of the ritual agents than the cultural practice itself. Finally, as Stefan Maul and others have urged, there is a growing effort to understand emic, culture-specific terminology, life worlds and traditions, and to avoid misunderstandings caused by spatially and temporally inappropriate comparisons or parameters. Here too, Persian studies is on the right track. I've already mentioned that the two-volume companion to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, edited by Bruno Jacobs and Robert Rollinger, is a handbook whose importance cannot be overestimated. In over 100 articles, it documents the progress of research since the 1990s. The fifth volume of the Oxford History of the Ancient Near East, edited by Karin Ratner and Dan Potts, and devoted to the Persian period, has also just been published. But also the handbooks of Pierre Brion, Lindsay Allen, Matt Waters, Lloyd Llewellyn Jones, Maria Brosius, and the speaker, as well as the two excellent survey articles by Robert Rollinger in the first volume on empires, more on this later, and in the Munich conference volume on ancient monarchies, should be mentioned in this context, as they each embody their author's own view of the empire and its history, and their different approaches to research questions and problems. Considerable progress has also been made in the field of specialized research, of which I will only mention here the topics of the military by Sean Manning, deportations by Chiara Matarese, and taxation by the authors of the anthology Taxation in the Achaemenid Empire, edited by Christine Kleber, as well as the regionally specific works on Egypt by Melanie Wasmuth, Henry Colburn, and Damien Agu-Labordère, among others, or Asia Minor by Beth Latife Summerer, Andreas Klingenberg, and others. I will return later to the areas of languages and language policy, administration, religions, and the ideology of rulers and rule, which have also been dealt with extensively. Recent scholarship has made a special effort to elaborate the global historical dimension and the special significance of the great Iranian empires of antiquity for the history of the area between Egypt and the Balkans in the west and Central Asia and India in the east. Building on older traditions, the Persian kings of the 6th to 4th centuries BC linked the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, the Fertile Crescent and the Iranian highlands, Central Asia and the Indian Ocean region economically, ecologically, culturally, and politically to such an extent that it is difficult to understand the further integration of the world without them. In two recent contributions, Robert has impressively demonstrated how accurate the description First World Empire of Antiquity is for the Persian Empire, not only in terms of the size of its territories, but also in terms of its charisma and its political, socio-economic, and cultural impress far beyond its borders. After Alexander, the Greeks and Macedonians also became increasingly involved in this multifaceted, entangled world, and the Parthian and Sasanian East in turn became a hub of cross-border cultural exchange. The approach of thinking in larger temporal and spatial dimensions had another consequence. The Achaemenid Empire is increasingly perceived as part of the history of the great Near Eastern empires, as Robert mentioned already. In this context, one likes to speak of the long first millennium BC. Comparative approaches have been able to work out commonalities and lines of tradition between them, as well as Achaemenid specificities, which, incidentally, do not include the allegedly greater political and religious tolerance of the Persian kings compared to their Assyrian predecessors. In recent years, comparative empire studies across epochs have also advanced research on the Achaemenid Empire. The two-volume work Imperien und Reiche in der Weltgeschichte, edited by Michael Gehler and Robert Rollinger in 2014, has set standards in this area, attempting to identify structural elements of empires. I would like to briefly mention and characterize some of them here, as they have since been taken up again and again in Achaemenid studies and have become starting points for investigations. Empires do not simply emerge, they evolve. This is true of the early Persian Empire, which is inconceivable without the Elamite and Assyro-Babylonian prehistories. Imperial borders are mobile, dynamic, and fluid, as the borderlands of Asia Minor demonstrate, where even in the time of the Attic-Delian League, there was no iron curtain between the land of the great king and the territories of the League members. This boundlessness gives rise to a territorial claim to rule on the part of the imperial ruling elite that can theoretically encompass the entire world. This is precisely what can be demonstrated ideologically for the Persian kings, whose rule is presented as absolute and universal, and whose inscriptions accordingly make no mention of neighbors or rivals for this rule. The recent work of my student Marie Oellich on the idea of imperial succession makes this very clear again. Empires are characterized by multi-ethnic and religious diversity, a diversity that is usually tolerated, often enough even encouraged. When this requirement is ignored, empires usually end up in crises and periods of instability. The same is true when the interests of the empire's population and elites are not taken into account. In the case of the Persians, the Persian wars and the policies of Xerxes were long seen as such a turning point, with a development towards steady decline. Scholarship has long since moved away from this view, even as it notes continuities and discontinuities in the history of the empire and beyond. One thing is certain: the end of the Achaemenid reign was rather surprising and was not the result of internal crises and signs of disintegration. The conference on the final phase of the history of the Achaemenid Empire, to be held in Vienna at the end of this year, will underline this once again. It is these elites who are integrated into the rule through the cultivation of a common ideologically charged self-image, and who communicate directly and indirectly with the ruling center on many levels. It is they who guarantee the economic and military potential of an empire. This was precisely the case in the Persian Empire, where, in addition to the Iranian ethnoclasse dominante, a variety of political entities and groups guaranteed the stability of the empire. Ethnicity is, of course, not to be understood in the conventional sense, but as a social construct. One could also become a Persian. The privilege that children of foreign fathers and Iranian women could be recognized as Persian speaks for both a hierarchization of affiliations in Achaemenid Iran, and the ancient use of ethnic designations. Further on, Achaemenid rule can be described as neither centralist nor despotic or even absolutist. Indeed, even the great king's behavior was bound by norms, and he was regarded as a mediator between gods and men, but not as a god, but as a man who was nevertheless heroized after his death for his services to the country and its people. It is only through the use of writing that the necessary bureaucracy can be administered and the imperial governmental apparatus can demonstrate its ability to function in administrative and financial matters. The tablets of Persepolis, the ostraca of Idumea, and now the Aramaic text of Bactria provide ample evidence of this. Although the empire had a differentiated and nuanced administrative structure with a multi-layered system of taxes and levies, which was intensively discussed in the proceedings of a Basel conference, the great kings do not describe their empire in their inscriptions in terms of provinces and administrative districts, but in a kind of systematically structured mental map of countries or peoples, Dakyava. They also speak not of regular dues, but of tribute, actually the share due to the ruler. And their functionaries are not referred to as such, but as followers, bandaka. The subject adherence to the data is intended to prevent disloyalty and rebellion. Empires tend to have a strong political center. In border areas, social and political connections and the imitation of imperial models often enough lead to secondary state formations and new empires. Macedonia under Philip and Alexander is one such example, as Sabine Müller and Julian Degen have recently shown. The development of the monarchical order there cannot be explained without the Persian model. And the examples of the so-called mountain and steppe peoples of the Zagros region and Central Asia, treated by Pierre Brion, Silvia Balatti and others, show on the one hand how flexible royal policy could be, and on the other, how the Achaemenid influence and the Achaemenid model also significantly changed the economic and social conditions in these areas. Empires almost inevitably have their own worldviews. They usually see their role as a mission of peace, culture, and civilization, or as a guarantor of security and prosperity. This sense of mission is essential to secure internal and legitimize external rule. Here too, as Robert and others have shown, the Achaemenid Empire is a good example. The rule of the Thespids and Achaemenids was legitimized, as the royal inscriptions proclaim, by deeds for the benefit of the subjects, by divine sanction, and by descent. In the Persian Empire, the ideological dichotomy of ruler-subject was complemented in realpolitik by a tradition-based and politically opportune diversity of relations between the two groups, with strict control from the center, but also with privileges for regional elites, local autonomy arrangements, the promotion of cultural and religious practice, and specific regional forms of justification of rule. By the end of the 6th century, Darius I had already put the empire on a new footing through administrative and economic reforms that proved their worth by the time of Alexander's campaign and continued to have an impact beyond. Empires have an interest in external and after effects which vary greatly according to historical development and the interests of their successors. Recent research has not only dealt intensively with the efforts of the Persian kings to consolidate their own rule and prefigure their own afterlife, but has also turned to Persianism, initially in a conference volume of the same name published in 2017. Persianism, that is, to quote Rolf Strootman and Miguel John Versluys, the, I quote, ideas and associations revolving around Persia and appropriated in specific contexts for specific socio-cultural and political reasons, end of quote. Hardly anyone has elaborated the significance of ancient Iranian traditions in intra-Iranian discourses and practices of domination as clearly as and convincingly as the host of our conference, Rahim Shayegan. To conclude this overview, it should be mentioned briefly that in the meantime, further empire conferences have taken place, also in a cross-epochal comparative approach dedicated to topics such as the end of empires or imperial borderlands, in which the Persian Empire played a not insignificant role. The reference to the intended afterlife of the Persian Empire brings me to my final point, the history of reception. The abundance of studies on this subject is overwhelming, as the Nachleben of the so-called Persian Wars in antiquity and post-antiquity alone suggests. Nevertheless, two developments cannot be overlooked. Firstly, the theoretical and methodological foundations of these studies. A good example being here the work of Felix Wiedemann on the interpretation of historical migrations, and on images of the Aryans, of Pierre Briand on the end of Persian rule, and on Alexander III in early modern and modern historiography, and of Reinhold Bichler and Wilfried Nippel on the concept of Oriental despotism in antiquity and early modern history. Secondly, the often problematic use of Persian institutions and figures in current cultural and political debates is remarkable. The images of Cyrus and their political ideological global marketing, some of which cannot be traced back to antiquity or are due to specific intentions, may suffice as one example among many. Despite all our efforts to deconstruct long-standing prejudices and cliches, but also to do justice to the works and people to whom we owe so much inspiration today, we will not run out of subjects for study and ideas, especially in the field of reception history. Thank you for your attention.